Let's talk about inflation.
Lately. Every time that we get a nice job report and a nice unemployment report where the unemployment is dropping, more people have jobs, people have better pay, suddenly the market dips. And it's not new, it's been happening for a year. So, what exactly is going on there?
I have a theory on this, and it involves first my definition or my understanding of the stock market. And I have a reason for this. And the reason is, the stock market is like a network. At the end of the day, it's the belief of the many that run the stock market to a certain extent. We've covered this in our interest rates episode where we say that, the interest rates are being increased so that there can be a slowdown in the economy. Now, what a slowdown in the economy means is that the economy stops growing at the rate at which it's growing. This would entail people losing their jobs, there being a higher unemployment, and things like that. When interest rates are increased, the market in itself inherently thinks or factors in the fact that people are going to be losing their jobs, the job report is going to be weaker, unemployment rate is going to be higher. Now, every time that this has not been the case, even though this is a very good sign for the economy, even though this states that the economy is growing, things are looking very good, because the market is expecting weaker jobs and it's expecting unemployment rates to be higher, it's reacting in a negative sense. So think about it like human beings interacting with each other, or just a singular human being. When you expect something, when you factored in for a certain outcome, be it negative or positive, and that outcome doesn't work the way you expect it to, your initial reaction is negative, right?
I love the view of the stock market being like a human being. And I love the feel that, the stock market has its own beliefs and has its own emotions. But when something good happens, then the immediate reaction should be a tick positive. However, this is not being perceived as good for whatever reason. And I have my own set of theory behind that. It's kind of counterintuitive, but as soon as there is a positive job market report, everybody has the fear that the Fed is going to raise the interest rates further. And just the belief that the money supply in the future is going to be lesser is causing people to go crazy and is causing people to sell their current holdings, which causes the stock market to take low. But the other side of the discussion is, why do they keep pushing the interest rates higher when we have a stronger job market and when we have, a better unemployment score than expected? And the reason for that hides in this one very, very elaborate word, and the word that we'll be talking about today, and that is inflation.
Ding, ding, ding. Keyword alert of the day: inflation.
So, what is inflation?
So, inflation, if you look at the dictionary term, is literally blowing air into something. You're inflating something. So, let's look at it in terms of basic economics, in terms of demand and supply first. So, think about there being a certain amount of money in the system. There is a supply of money, and then there's a demand for that money. Every time the economy grows bigger, every time there are more businesses, more companies, more jobs, the amount of money in the system increases. Now, the moment the amount of money in the system increases, and the moment there are going to be more people consuming things, and there are going to be more people spending money, using money, things that, and all that, when the inherent value of that money falls.
So, if you look at something as basic as demand and supply, around which all of economics is built, when you talk about limited edition goods, let's talk about this LV bag. And let's say there are only going to be 10 of these LV bags. They'll have a certain perception of value associated to them. And a major reason of their value is how limited they are in production. Now, when I produce the 11th of the same bag, the other 10 bags by themselves will lose value. So the value of the bag has now gone through inflation. Just like that, if there is, let's say, $100 million that is in an economy, and I put in a further $100 million into the economy, then every dollar by dollar being alike has lost half of its value. At least that is what the quantitative theory of inflation states, the one that you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, just very basically, if you have, as Akhil said, if you have something that is in limited supply, the fact that it is limited edition or the fact that it is limited gives it that sense of value. The moment you are increasing that limit, you essentially are reducing the value of all the others that exist. The amount of money increasing within the economy, the inherent value of every dollar goes down.
Right. My dollar today is worth more than my dollar will be worth tomorrow, because my dollar innately is going through inflation, which means it is innately losing its value. But there's another spanner in the mix, and that is that some of these countries that have thrown the most amount of money into their economies over the past decade, such as Japan, such as the US, have not gone through this extreme phase of inflation despite the massive monetary expansion, which means more money into the system. And this is excluding 2021 and 2022.
So we're saying that what we just said in terms of, you know, the amount of money in the system increasing, the places where it's increased the most is the US and Japan, and they have obviously, we're talking pre-COVID here. They have the most stable inflation.
In fact, they do. And they have massive debt to GDPs, which means the amount they produce in a year, they have equal amounts of debt, which again doesn't make sense. Why have they not undergone this massive inflation shift that, based on the quantitative theory, should be the case?
I'm out of my depth here, but so I'm going to let you take this.
Okay. So there's this economist, his name is Paul Krugman. And Paul Krugman is a Nobel Prize winning economist, and he discusses the emotional side of economics, the non number side. So, at the base of it, when we calculate things in economics, we make some assumptions. And the baseline assumptions here are that the amount of money in the system will be considered a constant to understand how much money will lose its value in the future. For example, let's say there is $20 in the system, and let's say there are going to be $100 worth of transactions in the system. Then that system will need to rotate those $20 five times in order for there to be the $100 worth of transactions. This, in economic terms, is called velocity of the money, which means the speed at which the money rotates in the system. When we talk about inflation, we always take this velocity as a given, as a constant. And we take this velocity as if it will not change despite me putting more money into the system, taking out money from the system. And I won't go into the mathematics of it here. But considering the velocity as a constant, when we discuss inflation, we say inflation is directly related to the amount of money we throw into the system. When Paul Krugman talked about it, he said that maybe the emotional component of inflation is a belief system. The belief that I have to pay more in the future causes me to charge my customers more now, which causes my customer to charge his customers more now, which causes his customers to charge their customers more now.
It's that whole vicious cycle, and I think that's exactly it takes us back to the example of the stock market. The stock market is predicting interest rates rising higher in the future because the job markets are strong. So they are predicting that, to borrow money in the future, it's going to be more expensive for them because, interest rates are going up. So they are reacting in a negative sense today in order to make sure that, they can have that effect. So it's again that whole cycle.
I can give you a better example. Let's say you're a milkman, and let's say you sell your milk at $3 a bottle. Now you realize that you need to purchase apples in order to carry your life forward. And you think that currently I buy apple at $2. Now you know you can consistently sell milk at those $3 and continue to consume apples at $2. Let's say you get the gist that, hey, my apples are going to be expensive tomorrow. I need to make more money, and my production on my milk is limited. So what will I do? I'll have to charge more for the milk. When I charge more for the milk, under the assumption that my apples are going to be more expensive, and the person who's selling the apples is under the assumption that when I buy my shoes tomorrow, my shoes are going to be more expensive. That is why I'm raising the price of my apples. Suddenly, everybody just believes that everything is going to be more expensive. And when things become more expensive is when we say, we are having massive inflation into the country. Now, this is somewhere where I am theorizing. But under this theory, when we talk about COVID, in COVID, the government threw a lot of money into the system. And that more money into the system in economic terms is called a monetary expansion. Expansion meaning making it bigger, and monetary meaning related to money. Now, when there was a massive monetary expansion, and it was not behind the hidden curtains of the Fed, it was out in the open. Everybody's bank accounts getting multiple stimulus checks, and the sellers being able to see that my buyer can pay more, and the buyers realizing that my seller is going to charge me more. Just this cycle just started going on and on in people's brain.
I think this whole cycle was started by the whole fact that, oh yeah, supply chains are affected. So again, the supply for sellers is going down. So therein, the buyers assume, okay, things are limited. So once something is limited, the value of that increases.
And their value increased also because the buyer had more purchasing power. They had more money in their pockets because even the job market did not crash as bad as was expected. The recovery of the job market was yet another astonishing fact. It happened fairly quickly. In fact, the country continuously ran out of labor. I remember I was in Chicago during COVID, and there were no Uber drivers because Uber drivers were getting their stimulus checks and they didn't need to drive an Uber to sustain themselves. One of my friends lost his job, and he was getting paid right around however much salary he was making just for sitting at home. So why would he work? He doesn't need to.
On top of everything, you think about the fact that there was COVID going around in spades, and there was all those, rumors about how it's spreading in this surface, that surface, air. So why would someone step out of their house and, do a job if they're getting a similar salary just sitting at home in the form of stimulus checks?
Exactly, right? And the whole country knows that the whole country has stimulus checks. So that's where the crux of inflation started. Now, when Fed is trying to take money out of the system, and when Fed is trying to take money out of the system in the future by raising interest rates in the future as well, that's when Fed is saying that I believe in this quantitative part of inflation, and I am going to raise interest rates so that people have lesser money, and when people have lesser money, they'll be willing to spend lesser. However, when the job report comes out and they see people still have the jobs, and they see that unemployment is still low, and they see that even the pay that people are getting in their jobs is still competitive, suddenly there's like a lot of confusion behind it. So that's where everything is just, it's one big circle, and how intricately everything is related. It's fantastic.
I guess it's all about the qualitative not meeting up with the quantitative because, as you just said, that the quantitative is saying that, okay, money is going out of the system, money is becoming more limited in supply. The value of each dollar should stop decreasing as much, and, you should have that control on inflation. But at the same time, one of the key factors that indicates an economy slowing down is jobs. And with the Fed increasing interest rates, with them wanting to control inflation, one of the main indicators of that is an unemployment rising. And the fact that unemployment does not rise because People are doing what we mentioned in our interest rates episode is they're part of shoestring businesses, and they're finding ways to sustain themselves that were earlier not conventional. You are seeing the belief and the numbers just not merging with each other. They're not matching with each other.
I think the other part of the puzzle here is that there's this discussion that a recession needs to happen for there to be control on inflation. And that is actually based off of a 1980s recession that was caused in the US on purpose. And when they caused that recession, they actually control the monetary policies and make them very stringent. What that means is they stopped supplying a lot of money into the system. When they stopped supplying that money into the system, suddenly the belief that people have money died. And the inflation hit from these massive 10%, 11% numbers straight down to 1%, 0%. And the country actually went through a deflationary period, which means that the dollar today is worth less than the dollar tomorrow.
They're limiting the amount of money in the system. So the moment that happens, the value of your money increases. So going back to that bags example that you gave earlier, imagine a company announced they're producing 10 bags. Suddenly they say, oh no, not 10, we're just producing seven. Or out of the 10, three have been destroyed, only seven remain. The seven that remain, their value goes up just because there's three less of them that are available.
Exactly. Look at Da Vinci paintings or look at this Michelangelo paintings, right? Their value is perceived because there are only so many of them. And one of them gets purchased, the value of all others get bumped up if they're ever going to be traded, because that's the only thing you can get your hands on. It's very similar with wine when there is like a very good grape. I went to this winery, Robert Mondavi, and they said 2017 was the best grape they've ever had. And their 2017 white wines were very, very expensive. So that's where it comes. It's always about demand and supply, but also the kind of emotion you can cause around something. Now, wine has this emotion connected with it that, yes, it can be an expensive commodity. An LV bag has that emotion that, yes, it can be an expensive commodity. If my nephew makes 5 images and says there are only going to be 5 of them, I'll have to work very hard in marketing to have, for them to have any kind of value to somebody. That is the perception of value. That is the emotion linked with the demand supply constraint that we're talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, there has to be a certain inherent value in the subject for it to then appreciate or depreciate in value. You look at the diamond market, they say that today diamonds are being mined in such a way that their value stays at the level that it is or goes up because they are limited. And if they were mined more, or there was more, if the companies that were mining these diamonds released more diamonds into the market would be flooded to such an extent that the value of diamonds would fall. So again, it's the same theory.
Diamonds, again, are a very, very funky subject, which I would love to discuss in detail in the future because, you know, diamonds right now, we are able to make man made diamonds that are indistinguishable from mined diamonds. And they have to actually mark them on purpose that this is a man made diamond. Please don't get confused.
Yeah, I mean, that's just that's all right. I mean, this is just something interesting I remember reading, and it blew my mind because you have this whole obsession with diamonds. So yeah, it was something that came into my head when we were talking about limited supplies and the possibilities of limited supplies.
I was watching this one YouTube video, which was like, diamonds are worth nothing, and you get to know when you go back to sell them. So when you're buying a diamond, the merchant is going to be like, oh, get this one. This is so good. This is worth this much. When you go to sell it, they tell you, nah, this is just a stone.
Isn't that true with everything though? When you want to go buy something, suddenly, it's such a valuable thing, one of a kind, never seen before. But when you go to sell something, oh, yeah, it's just that, nothing great.
Post this deflationary period, though, US pushed a lot of money into its economy. And like we spoke earlier, what happened was quite astonishing. The inflation did not increase because the mindset in the people that our inflation is low was so hard coded after the depression, after the recession, and it didn't change the innate behavior of me spending my disposable income, which is the income that I have available for expenditure.
So that's again talking about the quantitative and the qualitative not matching up.
So the next thing I would like to discuss would be the CPI. And the CPI stands for the Consumer Price Index.
So essentially, what the CPI does is it looks at a basket of goods that a person would use on a regular basis, and it looks at the price of that basket of goods today as compared to a base point for that same basket of goods. Just take your grocery list, for example. So you have milk, apple, eggs, vegetables. Say you spend $20 every week to get this basket of goods. So the CPI for 2023 now, or the price of this basket of goods today in 2023 is $20. However, say 3 years ago in 2020, which is being used as the base year to calculate CPI, the price of this same basket of goods, same quantity, same everything was $15. So they would say the CPI has gone up by a 33%. So yeah, that essentially is CPI. They look at the same basket of goods through different time periods and they compare the way the price of that particular basket of goods has changed.
It's fairly interesting how they get their prices for this basket of goods. There are like offices all over the US which are calling different people, different families, and asking them, what are you eating? How much are you eating? You know, what are you paying for it? And then they contact different sellers and ask them, how much are you selling this for? You would think it's a much more streamlined system now that we are like such a tech driven society, but they're still calling.
I would have assumed this is just data points on a graph which is being fed to them by like a Walmart or a Target or something, and they're just drawing their data from there.
I mean, you would think so, but that's not the case. Veritasium again made a very interesting video on how CPI is calculated and how people are actually getting these prices. He sits down with one of these officers, and the officer makes an actual call in front of him. And she explains to him that this is the way it has been done for so long, and this is the way it's continuing even now.
I mean, I guess I understand that on a buyer point of view. Today, if I had to call you and ask, I mean, if I had to get your data, your specific data as to what you're consuming, how would one do that? Thinking, I mean, if you think about the data point way, obviously a seller data is easier to get because you just contact these big, mega chains that exist in the US and you get all the data. But I understand that from a buyer point of view. I just don't understand that from a seller point of view.
I mean, as long as you really believe in MasterCard and Visa not sharing our details with the government,
Yeah, I guess that's an option. I didn't think of that.
or like in India, UPI data not being seen by the government to calculate these CPIs.
Isn't UPI done by the government? Isn't that just a government thing?
It is actually done by the government, so you never know what is happening.
So that's a very different can of worms.
However, transitioning back into our topic before we get into trouble, there are like a bunch of problems with CPI. And CPI, by the way, is the way we calculate our inflation. Whenever you hear that the inflation has gone up by this much percentage, it is because the CPI by itself has changed.
You must have read this headline, oh, food inflation is up by so much, or X inflation is up by so much, and then you get an overall inflation figure. So this is where you're getting all those separate figures from because they are looking at within the larger basket of goods. Like I said, your grocery items are coming in, the food inflation, your household items are coming in, your other. That's how this works.
So there are actually thousands of good in this basket. I know when you picture a basket, it's like 5 apples and some bananas sitting inside, like a very pretty looking basket, but that's not the basket that we're talking about here. And these thousands of goods can further be classified into different categories, as Vishrut said. The issues with CPI are that it is an average. It is trying to take all of those categories and it is trying to sum it up into this one single number. And most people don't bother to go deeper and look into the actual breakdown of what is it that is causing the inflation to bump up to such a high level.
Are these categories weighted?
The categories are weighted and the weights do remain fairly consistent year over year. But as an example of a major skew, a skew is something that pushes the number one side or the other. As an example of a major skew, during 2020 mid, the used car market had, gone through the roof. And the used car market inflation was at some 37 odd percent, which means that the used car that you would have gotten last year for, let's say, $100 was now worth $137, which is fairly crazy if you think about it. My friend bought his Sonata, right? And he bought his Sonata in 2013. When we went to see its price in 2021 January, it was worth $500 more than what he bought it for, while he had traveled 100,000 miles in his car. A car, after running 100,000 miles, which he bought secondhand, was going for $500 more than what he paid for 7, 8 years ago.
That is crazy.
No, what is crazy is we still didn't sell the car. Still sitting with him. When I met him this time, there was a lot of regret on his face.
I can't imagine why.
Well, neither could he.
Anyway, so getting back to the CPI.
Coming back to the crux of the discussion, when the used car market had an inflation of 37%, and the base number on the inflation was around 6.1%, think of the weight that 37% adds to that 6.1%. And at that time, food inflation was around 0.3%. At home food inflation was actually negative. So it was cheaper than last year to, make food at home and eat it. And yet, everybody would just see the inflation number by itself rather than going into the breakdown. And slowly and steadily, interestingly enough, when people started believing that this inflation number is true, the next inflation numbers, the food inflation started going higher. So that's the whole, the belief system started catching up.
Yeah, you said what I was thinking. It ties back into this whole thing of what you were talking about, how people's beliefs influence inflation.
I would again advise the listeners to go out there, read further about it. We would leave some books in the description below if you want to check out some books. I'll also add some videos in the description, and I highly recommend you go and watch them.
The other thing I was noticing about CPI is that it doesn't take into account quality. Going back to the car market, if you've purchased a car that has 100 horsepower and a couple of years later, that same car is now available at 130 horsepower, but also maybe $2,000 higher. CPI will take into account that $2,000 that the price has increased, but it will, how is it accounting for the 30 added horsepower that you're getting with the car? There is no measure for quality of products in CPI. So there is no way it can factor an increase in quality of a product as compared to the increase in price and give you that relative increase per se. There is something extra you're going to have to pay for that 30 extra horsepower, right?
And it's not just quality, it doesn't take into account the substitutes as well. So let's say today you use a ceramic glass and the ceramic glass is worth $1. And that same ceramic glass 2 years later is worth $1.15. But a steel glass in the same duration was worth $1 and is still worth $1. The inflation on the ceramic glass will outdo the inflation on the steel glass, even though they are direct rivals to each other and they are direct substitutes. So the basket doesn't substitute out the product from itself, even though they can be completely replaced.
So I guess what we're trying to say is that go beyond the headline. Don't look at the CPI figure as a whole and try to get into the details of things that maybe concern you a bit more. So if you are in the market for cars, look at the inflation on cars. If you are, obviously, food applies to all of us, so that's definitely a factor. I mean, something that we should all look into. And also take the CPI figures with a pinch of salt. There are always better things available, and there are things that doesn't account for.
I mean, even if we talk conclusively, the Fed themselves have stated that the CPI might be bloated from 0.9 up to 1.7%. And recently they actually made a change. I think in the 2010s sometime, and post that they have confirmed that the excess on CPI is around 1.1% approximately. So even at the base of it, when you see a CPI number such as 6%, you can just cut it down to 5% in your head, because the CPI might be blatantly overstating it. Other than that, of course, jump into the categories and read more about it. Just understanding a little more about these very basic concepts that really affect our lives, such as interest rates, such as CPI, such as GDP, can really change our perspective on the world and our perspective on these topics.
Yeah, I definitely feel that, we hear these terms so much, and especially nowadays with the amount of news we're getting, the amount of news we're consuming, that knowing more about these terms, knowing a little more, not even too much more, is just so much easier to understand and so much easier to sort of base your opinions on. Because, as we said, everything is affected by human emotion. Everything, whatever we are thinking, whatever we're feeling, has an effect, because we, at the end of the day, are part of the mass. So what the mass is thinking, what our behaviors are indicating, that's what's affecting the country's economy as well. Akhil, you were telling me about a very interesting study done in 1996.
So in 1996, this very famous economist called Robert Shiller, he actually won the Nobel Prize in 2013. He conducted a study of how study of economics changes a person's attitude. And how he did that is he made several statements, and he asked normal non-economics people and economics people to make, their comment whether they agree or disagree with the statement. So the first statement was, inflation hurts my buying power and it makes me poorer. Normal people said 77% of them agreed with this view, while economists said 12% of them agreed with the view. So I think the major assumption behind this is that if I am to get a 5% pay raise and inflation is at 3%, then I only gain 2% of power I only gain 2% of purchasing power. However, if there was no inflation, I would have gained 5% of purchasing power.
However, if there was no inflation, what is motivating the company to give you that raise? Because the company has to be earning more money to give you that raise, right? Where is that more money coming from?
Exactly. So inflation allows the company to sell the product at a higher price, making more profit for the company, making your marginal utility more to the company, making the company pay you more money.
Yeah, it comes back to the whole thing that if you look at growth, if you studied economics even at a basic level, the first thing that comes along with economic growth is inflation. Any period of economic growth in any country or any economy has to be accompanied with inflation. It's the biggest indicator of economic growth.
The second statement that was made was, when I see projected cost of college and cost of living a decade down the line, I fear my income won't rise as much. 66% of the laymen agreed with this statement, while only 5% of economists agreed with the same statement, which again shows you, like, having a perspective on inflation. If the inflation is going to be this number, then my pay raise is going to have to be higher than this number. And if it is not, then I have the power to negotiate it higher based on this number.
I think the biggest mistake that people are making here is that they're comparing a change over a decade to a change every year. You get an increment in your salary every year. It compounds in a certain way that gets you to that final figure. Whereas what they're looking at for colleges also is something that is compounding year on year. It's not just one fine day that colleges decide that, oh yeah, it's been 1 year. I mean, it's been 10 years that we've had this pay structure. Let's increase it by 50%. That's not how it works. Everything is a gradual process, and it again ties into the previous point. It's only because universally prices are increasing that colleges are also increasing their fees. Prices of houses are also increasing because of the same factor. Your your salary, the housing prices, price of education, everything is linked. It's all one thing after the other. It's all a chain.
I think what needs to happen here is added perspective. As somebody who gets affected by inflation, one should understand that these are the items that I use in my day to day life. These items are going to lose their value in this format. For example, let's say food is something that I am going to consume, and food by itself has lost value at a steady 3%. Then my salary needs to at least increase by 3% the next year for me to sustain my lifestyle. And that would be me not having gotten anything extra. So you can pass this inflation basket and you can see for yourself how much value do you generate out of that with a given set of increase that you might get at your job. There were a number of other statements in the study, but like last one that I would like to discuss is if my pay went up, I would feel more satisfaction in my job, even if prices went up just as much. And around 49% agreed with that as laymen, but only 8% of economists did. And from today, I would like to recommend all of you all to behave like economists and to try and understand a bit more about how this loss of value in innate money that you have in the bank account affects your life, and how this loss of value of your next year's salary will affect your life, or how this loss of value of the net income in your business affects your life, and what is the basic level of increase that you need to see if you are a seller of goods or if you're a buyer of goods.
I think this term economist sounds very heavy, but at the end of the day, come to think of it, we are all in some way or the other contributing to the economy. We are all that we're definitely consumers. We're definitely making money, and that is contributing to our country's GDP. So all of us do play a part, and all of us are in some way or the other economists. So we might as well start thinking as one of them.
I think whether we like it or not, economics plays a huge role in our lives and governs even the minute intricacies of our day to day activities and our expectations from the future. An economist, being as huge a word as it is, resides in all of us. And here we are trying to poke the one in you just a little bit. Hopefully, we were successful and would love to know your thoughts and opinion on inflation. Feel free to send us direct messages or get in on the discussion under our YouTube video by the same name. See you there.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Thought Bistro podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation and were able to learn something new. If you liked the episode, please be sure to subscribe to our show and leave a review on your favorite podcast app. You can also follow us on social media. Our Instagram and Twitter handles are available in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and we shall see you in the next one.